The Joslin Diabetes Center. Is their advice actually worth following? That's exactly what we'll cover in this video. Here's what you can expect to learn. First, we'll talk about what is the Joslin Diabetes Center, followed by its approach to diabetes, what it says about exercise and nutrition, as well as weight loss, monitoring and supplements, what it gets right, and what do I think can be improved, changed, or modified to make it even more effective than it already is, and a final verdict. Before we jump in, who am I? My name is Igor. I'm the author of the Amazon best-selling book, Type 2 Diabetes Reversal Secrets. As well, I run an online personal training company that specializes in type 2 diabetes reversal. So let's jump in. First of all, what is the Joslin Diabetes Center? First of all, it is one of the oldest diabetes centers in the world, affiliated with Harvard Medical School, trusted by millions of patients, and it is a global leader in diabetes care. But in spite of all these impressive credentials, are their recommendations actually the best? So, what do they recommend? Weight loss, exercise, nutrition, proper nutrition, certain medications, monitoring blood sugar, and diabetes education. Seems pretty sensible to me. Now, do they believe that diabetes can be reversed? And to answer this question, a lot of people use the words cure and reversal interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. So let's explore the differences. Here is what a cure is. A cure is a person becomes completely healthy, diabetes is gone forever, and there's nothing you can do to bring it back. That is a cure. Reversal is different. Or another word used for it is reversal. Using a healthy lifestyle, which consists of diet, exercise, potentially weight loss, diabetes can be controlled. That means you can drop your blood sugar levels essentially into non-diabetic ranges. However, if a person regains the weight, stops exercising, then the diabetes returns. In other words, it doesn't stay gone forever. It stays gone as long as the conditions for its return are not met. I hope that makes sense. So, what does Jocelyn recommend in terms of exercise? Their recommendations are actually quite solid, quite a bit more aggressive than public health guidelines. They recommend 150 to 300 minutes per week of aerobic exercise or cardio. For strength training, three times per week. A lot of guidelines say 2 times per week. They say 3 times per week, which I believe is a stronger recommendation. They recommend stretching or flexibility training, as well as working on your balance and individualized exercise prescription. They don't say everybody should do this program. They say you should individualize your program, work with a exercise physiologist or personal trainer to get personalized exercise guidance. And they also recommend progressive overload. Don't stay at the same weight or the same duration, the same intensity forever. You should gradually increase over time. So they make a lot of great recommendations, and here is where we agree. We both agree that cardio and strength training should be combined. We both believe in progressive overload. Full body workouts are likely superior to body part splits when it comes to diabetes management. Balance training, if your balance is off to begin with, and individualization. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. There are a few things that I think would make their exercise prescription a bit more effective. Um, One is that I believe there should be a greater emphasis on high intensity cardio. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody who hasn't exercised in a very long time should start and go for a sprint. That's not what I'm saying. But after about 1 to 3 months of low and moderate intensity cardio, they should build up to high intensity. Why do I make that recommendation? Well, here is one study comparing um, moderate intensity to high intensity. It's titled Continuous versus Interval Training on Glycemic Control and Macro and Microvascular Reactivity in Type 2 Diabetic Patients. Here is what this study did. They compared continuous cardio to interval training where the caloric burn was the same. In other words, the interval training group exercised for less time, but because it was more intense, they burned more calories per minute, so they exercised for fewer minutes. And the A1C reduction in the continuous group was from 9.7 to 9.4, so only a 0.3 point reduction. However, in the interval training group, despite exercising less, they got triple the result. They had a drop from 9.6 down to 8.7, a 0.9% drop. And the average blood glucose in the continuous group dropped from 175 to 170 milligrams per deciliter. And in the interval training group, it dropped from 173 to 157 milligrams per deciliter. Quite impressive considering they exercised less and they got triple the result. So that's one area where I would modify. Focus more on high intensity cardio after 1 to 3 months of low to moderate intensity. One other thing that I would modify is Be more specific with strength training exercise prescription. The number of repetitions you do makes a big difference. Research shows that when somebody does 8 to 10 reps, it's superior to higher reps and lower reps. This is the sweet spot where somebody who's doing strength training only can drop their A1C by about 1.0 to 1.2%. You don't see those kinds of reductions with higher and lower reps. The amount of weight should be used is about 70 to 80% of a person's one repetition maximum, or the maximum amount of weight that they can lift for one time. Um, I would also be less concerned about accumulating huge amounts of cardio if intensity is high. Again, when the intensity is high, you don't have to do it as long. Um, so overall, the recommendations, the exercise recommendations of the Joslin Diabetes Center are really, really good. I would just make a few modern modifications to make it even more effective. What about nutrition? What does Joslin recommend? First of all, they recommend the best of many worlds, which is the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, which stands for dietary approaches to stopping hypertension, low carb diet, as well as a keto diet. So there are positive elements for all three. So here is where we agree. We both agree on the Mediterranean diet, personalizing or individualizing, whole foods, fiber, and limiting processed foods. Here is what I think they could do to make it even more effective. One, calories deserve more emphasis. Why? Because calories are king, more so than carbs, more so than glycemic index, more so than glycemic load. Here's a study titled The Effect of Short Periods of Caloric Restriction on Weight Loss and Glycemic Control in Type 2 Diabetes. What they found is that just by reducing their calories, they reduced everything. Carbs, protein, fat, everything, calories in general. Their A1C dropped from a starting level of 7.9 to 8.4% down to below 6%. Basically, they normalized their A1C levels. They reversed their type 2 diabetes without anything specific, of just a very simple prescription of eat less. They didn't say eat less of this, they just said eat less, period. Here is what else I would modify. The other thing I believe is that fiber deserves much more emphasis. Here is a study titled Beneficial Effects of High Dietary Fiber Intake in Patients with Type 2 Diabetes Mellitus. And here is what they found. They compared people between moderate fiber and a high fiber intake. Moderate fiber ate 24 grams of fiber per day. A high fiber group ate 50 grams of fiber per day. The calories were equal, just the composition of those calories was different. The high fiber group had 12% lower insulin, 10% lower blood sugar, and 10.2% lower triglycerides. So that's another modification. A third modification I would make is that carbohydrates are important, but they're number three. They're the third primary focus. Number one is calories, number two is fiber, and number three is carbs. Why? Because here is a study titled Comparison of Low and High Carbohydrate Diets for Type 2 Diabetes Management. The high carb diet, 53% of their daily calories came from carbohydrates. The low carb diet, 13% of their daily calories came from carbohydrates. And they both had the same reduction in A1C. So in terms of pure blood sugar control, they're about equal. But when you broaden the perspective, there is a slight superiority to low carb diets, and that is the blood sugar variability was lower in the low carb group. In other words, the difference between the lowest and the highest blood sugar level in the day was a smaller gap. They had fewer sugar spikes on the low carb diet. Their triglycerides were also a little bit lower, and their HDL cholesterol was a little bit higher. So there is a slight, but not a major superiority to a low carb diet when you're just looking at diet only. A lot of these things, the triglycerides, the blood sugar variability, the HDL cholesterol, the gap is even smaller when you start using the other guidelines from the Joslin Diabetes Center, like their exercise guidelines. This is looking at diet only as a standalone intervention for diabetes. Here is what else I would modify. Um, the glycemic load, I don't think it's as important as most people think. Um, Here's a study titled Effects Comparison Between Low Glycemic Index Diets and High Glycemic Index Diets on HbA1c and fructosamine for patients with diabetes. Just a short explanation. A1C is the average blood sugar for the last 3 months. Fructosamine is the average blood sugar for the last 3 weeks or so. Um, And here's what they found. The difference between a high glycemic load diet and a short, sorry, should be a slow, it should be low glycemic load diet. There is only a slight advantage to low glycemic load, and largely that's explained by the fiber content. Uh, Foods that are low on the glycemic load or low on glycemic index also are high in fiber. So this is really a non-issue. You don't really have to worry about it. They also recommend weight loss. And yes, losing weight is recommended, but it's a way to improve your blood sugar levels, but it's not the only way. You don't have to lose weight. It's just a good option, a very good one. Um, Here's a study specifically on strength training showing blood sugar reductions with strength training only and no loss in weight. Not to say you shouldn't lose weight if you have weight to lose. However, we should consider that probably about 35 to 40% of diabetics are normal weight. They don't have weight to lose. This applies only to overweight and obese diabetics. What about blood sugar testing? Joslin recommends testing fasting glucose, A1C, glucose after a meal, which by the way is already a very good recommendation because a lot neglect the post-meal glucose rise, which is a very, very important measurement. I think those are really good recommendations. And to that, I would add, I would keep fasting glucose, keep A1C, keep glucose after meal. In addition to that, I would add a measurement called C-peptide. C-peptide is a measurement of fasting insulin better than fasting insulin itself because it's more stable in the blood. So it's not just enough to know what's your blood sugar. It's also important to know how much insulin is required to keep your blood sugar where it is, because two people with the same blood sugar level may require different amounts of insulin to keep it there. The person who needs less insulin is the healthier person. They're said to be more insulin sensitive. Another test I recommend is something called the OGTT. That stands for Oral Glucose Tolerance Test. What that is you drink a very, very sweet drink between 50 and 75 grams of pure glucose, and you get your blood sugar measured before and then afterwards at 20 or 30-minute intervals until it comes back to normal. It tells you, do you have a normal blood sugar rise or an abnormal blood sugar rise? And the last test I would recommend is glycomark. Glycomark is a test that measures the difference between your lowest blood sugar and the highest blood sugar throughout the day. It's called your glycemic variability. So again, Johnson's recommendations are already very good, and I would just add a couple of those above that. What about supplements? There are certain supplements that have been shown to be quite effective for type 2 diabetes in people. One is milk thistle. Here's a study titled The Effects of Silymarin Supplementation on Metabolic Status and Oxidative Stress in Patients with Type 2 Diabetes Mellitus. And by the way, silymarin is the active ingredient in milk thistle. And here is what they found. Milk thistle reduces A1C by 1.40% when taken between 1.5 and 12 months. That is super, super powerful. Aloe vera also has favorable effects. Here's one study titled Reduction of Fasting Blood Glucose and Hemoglobin A1C using Oral Aloe Vera. And what they found is reductions of about 1.05%. And again, I want to emphasize this is without any changes in nutrition or exercise or medications. This is just with aloe vera alone. Same thing with ginger. Here's one study about ginger or a systematic review, and what it showed was a reduction of 1.0% in a 1 to 3 month period. Pretty impressive. So here's what I think Joslin gets right. First of all, it has a strong emphasis on education. Why do you have diabetes? What are the lifestyle factors that you can control to improve diabetes and so on? It recommends way more exercise than average. General public health guidelines are 150 minutes per week. This recommends 150 to 300 minutes per week. Recommends weight management. Calories are the most powerful thing you can do. You can modify in order to manage your diabetes. Individualization, evidence-based care, and realistic expectations. But here is where I disagree, or here's where I think it could be improved, not necessarily disagree. One, I think there's not enough emphasis on fiber. Research shows that diabetics have higher fiber requirements compared to non-diabetics. The general public, who is not diabetic, requires about 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories. Diabetics need about 20 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories. Calories should receive more attention than carb restriction alone, because again, it's caloric restriction that normalizes diabetes, not just carb restriction. Carb restriction is a method of calorie restriction, but it's not the only way. Um, Strength training deserves more emphasis. In other words, they already recommend 3 days per week, which is amazing. That's more than a lot of public health guidelines. But I think they could use a bit more precision with their exercise prescription for strength training. Also, I think they're it would make sense to test their fasting insulin and C-peptide a bit more, and supplements are underutilized. There is good research about supplements, about their safety and effectiveness in type 2 diabetes, but Joslin doesn't really speak up about them. If you want to go deeper into diabetes reversal, I created a very special video called the Diabetes Reversal Checklist. 3 simple steps to lower blood sugar naturally. This goes deeper into exercise and nutrition for type 2 diabetes reversal. This video is not available on YouTube. However, it is available to you for free download at this link on your screen right now or in the description below.